amazing Australians and the story of their lives. You're tuned to Lots to Chat About with Rosemary Peters-Wald.
Well, here we are again, and welcome, listeners. It's great to be back with you. My guest today is well-known and award-winning author Jennifer Batcher. I will spell that out because if you actually see it on Jennifer's books, you may not relate it to the spelling. It's B-A-C-I-A. Jennifer was born in the UK and grew up in Australia. It took a meeting with the famous author Sidney Sheldon to encourage her to finish her first novel. From there, Colleen McCulloch introduced her to the wonderful agent Selwa Anthony. This fortuitous meeting resulted in the publication of her first suspense thriller, Shadows of Power, also known as Indecent Ambition. Jennifer has now written many, many books. Welcome, Jennifer.
Nice to be here. Thanks, Rosemary.
Lovely to have you. You were more or less Sydney's well-known agent Selwa Anthony's first author when she started her agency, and she managed to sell your first novel to publishers and TV at a huge advance. Now, it would have to be an author's dream, and, I might add, probably an agent's dream, I would think. Selwa was over the moon, as were you. So, tell us a little bit about that.
Well, it was thrilling, I must say. You know, when I wrote that first book, as I was writing it, I had to have that sort of dream in mind, actually, you know, and I thought, because it was Selwa who actually pointed out when we met, that since the 40s, it had been that long before Australia produced its own and published its own writing. Most books then in the interim were imported from Britain or the US.
Oh, okay.
So it was it was the first sort of homegrown suspense novel that made it internationally,
yes.
And was bought only half finished. I couldn't even really type. So it was, you know, backspacing and rubbing things out and all that sort of thing. And the fact that she thought it had potential was absolutely fabulous. And I was the first female in her stable of authors. She had a male author and she was looking for the female author. And Selwa's point of difference from other agents at the time was that she was interested in commercial fiction.
Right.
You know, whereas there was a lot of literary fiction published in Australia, but it was the commercial fiction line that really hadn't been emphasised or looked at.
Exactly. And although she and Colleen McCulloch were great friends, and I might add Selwa is also my agent, but I haven't had quite the success that Jennifer has, but never mind, had a couple published. But as I say, Colleen was not one of her writers, but they ended up being fantastic friends and right to the end of Colleen's life. So she, of course, was one of our very, very well-known authors, wasn't she?
She was, absolutely. And she got published outside of Australia too because she was living in the States at the time.
Yes.
So Thornbirds was picked up by American publishers then.
Oh, right, yes. And then, of course, you were Pan Macmillan's, one of their very first authors, or their first author, I think, to have your book bought by Free Poland. And we're going to go into that later, if that's okay, because that's where your family and your inspiration for a number of your novels, particularly your last one, Dark Side of the Harbour, comes from. So tell us how it actually got into Free Poland at that stage.
Well, obviously, publishers were looking for the markets that were opening up there as well as anywhere else. And when I got the telegram that my book had been the first of the Pan Macmillan stable to be published there, I was thrilled because my father's family, my father was born in Poland.
Yes.
And to see a translation was just such a thrill. It really was. Although it was quite a racy novel, the first one, so I was hoping that my 90-year-old grandmother wasn't going to be offended by anything.
Oh, well, you might have got to customs at Poland and they said, no, you're not allowed in, you wrote that novel. But how wonderful. And did it get translated into many other languages as well?
Yes, it did. Well, firstly, it was a lead title in Britain, which
Yes.
was, again, a first, which means it gets all the publicity and the hype and the whatever. It was a book club choice.
Right.
And then it was picked up in Sweden, Germany, Greece. Yeah.
Yes.
It was a fabulous start. It was just amazing.
Oh, gosh.
But the thing was, then the publishers kept saying, well, now what's your second book about?
Yes.
And all I'd ever dreamed of was having a book published with my name on it.
Yes.
And all of a sudden I thought, oh, I've got to write another one? And, of course, by then I realised that I loved the creative act so much that I did want to write again. But it was hard, but I was determined I wasn't going to be a one-book author. And so I managed to do it again and again and again.
And 9 or 10 times later. But do you ever get writer's block? I mean, particularly I think if that happened to me and somebody said, now I've paid that much or whatever for your first one, now produce a second one, I'd think, oh my God, I didn't know where to start. But you obviously didn't.
Actually, not writer's block. Once I'm writing, I'm fine. But it's actually figuring out the bits and pieces that I need. Because of suspense, it's quite difficult. Yes. And I have to figure out all the bits and pieces that will propel the story forward, or maybe not even all of them, some of them, and have a vague idea of the ending. And I've got to have a character that really interests me to write about. And with my books, I've always, although they're entertainments, I try also to teach the reader something.
Right.
So I'll either use backgrounds of sometimes current events, sometimes a little bit further back in time, and perhaps introduce them to topics that they might never have thought of being interested in.
And for some time you had a regular column with the Sunday Mail, is that right?
It is, Rosemary. And I found then that I actually had a knack for writing humour, mainly because I poked fun at myself in most of the columns. Things like when I built my house, my wardrobe size on the plan was probably twice the size of the bedroom, as I wrote it in a funny way. Or things like where you forget your shopping list, so you come home with there's a whole hallway full of iced Vovo.
Oh, right.
So it was fun to do. Yeah.
A sort of real life,
Yes, it was picking those things and seeing how you could make fun of them.
Absolutely. And you've lived in lots and lots of places around the world. Have you got a particular favourite place or a favourite place that inspired your writing for you?
Well, in a way, the favourite places, yes, did come first and then inspire the writing, because I lived in Melbourne for a while, and I met a girl who was the inspector for the British language schools in Italy. And she offered to give me some contacts. And I had stopped in Rome on just a stopover for 4 or 5 hours on a previous visit, and fallen in love when I'd taken the bus in to have a look, So back I went, and I lived for 9 months in Rome.
Oh, how lovely.
I had a ball, really, really enjoyed it. And over the years since then, my husband and I have gone back to Italy every June. We just loved it. I'm so glad that he loved it too, But apart from there, I've lived in London. I did a small writing course in London at one stage. And I've lived in Los Angeles. My sister lived there. It wasn't for very long that I was there. And Sydney and Melbourne. So I guess it all gave me a pretty good background when I came to write.
And tell me, your father, who tragically you lost when you were very, very young. So how did your parents end up in Australia? So did he come over first and met your mother, or they both came over?
He was a Polish officer.
Right.
He had the Polish VC, the Virtuti Militari. He had the French Croix de Guerre. Very modest man. My mother didn't even know he had those medals till he put them on his uniform when they married. But she was an unusual woman. So he was with the post-war forces. They didn't know what to do with the Poles. It was in Scotland.
Yes.
And they met at a dance. And my mother, he was very attracted to her red hair straight away, because they don't see too many redheads in Poland. And she had inherited the family business when her father died during the war, and her brothers were away fighting. So she was a girl of 16 running a 50-men company.
How incredible.
And it was incredible. And she used to tell us that when we were children, but it didn't sink in because we were only about that age, but we still didn't get it, Yes. And it's only as the years passed that I've realised what an amazing woman she was. So when they married, she was the one with the money. My father had academic qualifications, but he had no country to go back to, and he knew what happened. They were starting to learn what happened if they went back, that they were looked on as enemies of the people. And because by that stage Poland was, in a socialist situation with the Russians, the Soviets, I should say. So when I was born, he felt very settled. He said to my mother, I now feel I belong here. But he also had double pneumonia 3 times in the year I was born. And the doctor then recommended a warm climate.
Yes.
And I wish they hadn't taken it quite so literally, because Brisbane in summer does me in. My genes were absolutely born in the cold.
Exactly.
So that's how they ended up out here.
But your father was an incredible man, wasn't he? Because he fought in the Second World War, of course. He fought with the Polish army. But then he escaped into Switzerland and ended up fighting with the British forces, didn't he?
Well, what actually happened was that when Poland fell, he was one of the lucky few that managed to escape the Russians coming in or the Soviets coming in from the east. And he escaped through Romania, Yugoslavia, took a boat with the remnants of the Polish army around to Marseille in France. And then, because they retrained very quickly, because it was under the same Napoleonic code of military system in France as in Poland, and so then he was sent to fight in the east of France, in the Doubs forest area. And it was there that when France fell, and he managed to hold the bridge that allowed as many of the fleeing army and citizenry to get into Switzerland.
Right.
So that's what happened there. So he fought with the French.
And in your novel, Dark Side of the Harbour, which I've read and thoroughly enjoyed, of course you draw a bit on the Polish history there. I am Irish, as our listeners know, and came out to Ireland in 1954. But I came out speaking English, of course, but for migrants that came out from places like Poland, which is where my husband's family originally came from, it was a whole different kettle of fish, really, wasn't it? So where did they end up living when they came out?
Well, they did go straight to Brisbane because my mother had a brother living here and he was singing the praises of Australia.
Yes.
But my father already spoke good English because, you know, the Poles with their geography have been having to speak languages to survive for quite a long time. Remember, I mean, he spoke German.
Yes.
He spoke French. And, of course, then he perfected his English. And when we were children, Mother would say to him, you should talk to the girls in Polish. And he said, no, I want to speak perfect English.
Right.
So, yeah, by the time they got... I mean, I suppose it's aided by having a British wife. It made it a bit easier in that regard, you know.
Yes. And what was it... Oh, well, you were so young, of course, you wouldn't remember so much, but I'm wondering what it was like in Brisbane at that time when they first moved here. So what year are we talking?
They came in 52 when
right,
my
yes.
sister was born in Australia. So Mother was pregnant with her when they left. So she's the real Aussie in the family. And, you know, Australia in those days, and even up to the time until my father died, was such a different place, of course. Everything was slower. Everything was easier. It just seemed it was a different way of life altogether. Yes. But the interesting thing was that after Dad died, my mother was determined that we should go and see his family as well as her family in Scotland. And feisty little woman, you know, in those days people just didn't up with their family and go off, but we did. And to go to Poland, of all places. And my father had been actually quite a leader in the Polish community in Brisbane and actually helped to establish the Polish Ex-Servicemen's Association in Queensland. And when people came out from Poland on cultural things like the orchestra, the Warsaw Philharmonic or the ballet or whatever, we entertained them at our home. And it was when those things were happening that my father was approached by government officials, so I guess we're going back looking at ASIO in this case, and told that if anyone wanted to defect, that he was to let them know. So, you know, I was aware of all this at quite a young age, and I was always very interested in Eastern European history, Cold War history. You know, I read a lot of books.
And you went back to Poland, of course, before the Iron Curtain was lifted. Rob and I went back actually tracing his family, but it was in the 1990s. And I must admit some parts of Poland at that stage were a little bit confronting, but I would imagine going back when you did. How old were you, Jennifer?
Well, when Mother took us that first time, I was 19.
Right.
And so for two girls from country town Brisbane to go to this big, bleak, dark, no neon, no Coca-Cola. What was in the shops was gherkins, bits of meat that you could barely distinguish, that you had to bring your own paper to wrap them in. It was an eye-opener, I must say. And in the hotel that we stayed at in Warsaw, you'd come down for breakfast one morning and they might have the sugar, but they wouldn't have butter, and vice versa on different days. And we also had a run-in with the secret police. So if I wasn't going to be a writer, I was certainly prompted at that stage, Rosemary, and I drew on it all, you know, as the books, that became my career.
Yes.
Obviously, it all stays in your brain and out it comes.
It does. I have to admit that I have a novel set in Poland as well, or partly Poland, but it's sitting in my top drawer.
Oh, sounds interesting.
One of the things that I couldn't get over is driving into our car park in a very sort of shabby hotel. I suppose no, it was fine, but there were police or a guard at the front gate, and you weren't allowed in unless you showed passes, this, that, whatever. And you were always living in a little bit of fright that your hire car was sort of going to be stolen and taken over the border to Russia or whatever. But I have no idea whether things have improved a lot. But having said that, the countryside was absolutely beautiful, the Saui Mountains and all of that area. Have you been back since? Or?
Oh, yes, I have, a couple of times. And the first time when I went with my husband, I'm sure he got sick of me saying, I can't believe it, I can't believe it.
Yes.
You know, there were shops with all the fruits in it. There was modern buildings. The maintenance of everything was up to scratch. It was so different. And I was so pleased and at the same time sad that my dad hadn't lived long enough to see his country free and to make up for the 60 years of economic, you know, status that had been the situation.
Exactly, yes. How old was he when he died?
54.
Far too
he
young.
was older than my mother, but
Yes.
far too young. Yeah.
Absolutely. So now tell me, you met Mikhail Gorbachev at some stage. How did that come about?
Well, that was one of the few times, or maybe the only time in my life, if I have to say, I was very pushy. I had the profile as the writer at that stage, quite, you know, I had a lot of my books out. And I saw this, he was coming to speak at some convention with a number of other people, including Norman Schwarzkopf from the Iraq War general, the American. And I rang up and I told them about my background. And I said, look, it would be absolutely wonderful if I could get a chance to meet him, because you could get a chance to meet him if you spent $5,000 on your ticket for, for the evening event.
Right.
So my husband and I went to the talk during the day, but I had asked the company who were setting this up if it would be possible just to come along to the evening bit that was on at the art gallery. And they said, leave it with us. And that's the sort of comment my husband used to make in business if he didn't want to follow up on people. But about 3 weeks before the evening, I said to my husband, oh, could I possibly be pushy enough to ring again and ask? But I really wanted to meet this man who had done so much to change what was then a terrible situation, you know, economically, but everything was, you know, they could see so much put into military hardware, etc., all the old guard that was barely keeping pace with what was happening. So it was my big thing to meet Mikhail Gorbachev. So I did ring again, Rosemary, and we got invited. Yes, we got invited. And so he signed my copy of Perestroika.
Right.
I thanked him. And then I rang the relatives in Poland when I got home. Well, they weren't the slightest bit impressed.
Oh, really?
Yes.
Well, but he was very pleasant and nice.
Yes. Oh, yeah, a very clever man, badly treated by his own country in the end.
Right.
You know, I mean, I always said he wanted to help Russia economically, but he didn't want to lose the empire. And I think that just ran away from him.
Exactly.
And we see the result now.
Yes, we do, sadly. So, Jennifer, now you taught writing at Bond University. Do you have any real hints for there might be would-be writers out there who have a wonderful idea for a novel in their head, but they can't quite work out how to start?
I was invited to establish the creative writing course at Bond, and delightfully, 3 of my pupils got published in the days when you didn't self-publish, where they got picked up by publishers. And part of the things that I would say to people is if you have an idea, don't talk about it, because once you've talked about it, you've told your story.
Yes.
Keep it to yourself, make your notes. The other thing is people can over-research, which means they get all tied up and they think they're writing, but all they're doing is filling the time by maybe telling far too much that they won't even need to use for their story. So for me, when I start a story, what happens is that aha moment when I find the line that opens the story for me, because I might have the storyline in mind. I have to have a passion for the story. I mean, I could have written maybe 3 times as many books if I'd written purely because I had a storyline.
Yes.
But I need to have the passion that keeps me at my desk. It just transports me.
Right.
And something I want to say, Rosemary. So that's how it works for me, and that's what I tried to give my students some idea about.
And is your day structured? I mean, I've heard of some people that get up sort of and write from 5 o'clock in the morning till 8 o'clock, and then they do such and such, then they go back to writing again. And I think Ernest Hemingway was one of those sort of people. Do you have a structured day, or is it just when you...
When I'm writing, I have a structured day that doesn't start anywhere near at 5 a.m.
Right.
My brain usually starts at about 10:30. And also, you know, one of the things for me in finding ideas for stories is reading the media. So,
Yes.
I mean, I've always been an avid newspaper reader all my life. And there are so many things, and then in the old days you took out your clippings, you know, and now, of course, you can just photograph them on your iPad or whatever you do. But so then I write, and the only thing that stops me is either the dogs nudge me or I'm hungry.
Yes.
And then I'll have a quick bite, and then I can be, and because it takes me so long to think up my idea to get it to work, then I have to write quickly. So I could be writing till 2 or 3 in the morning, but I
Yeah.
don't even notice.
No,
And the lovely thing is you don't have to dress up. You're not in the traffic.
exactly.
It's
They actually
perfect.
say it's quite a lonely profession. You are listening to Lots to Chat About. My guest today is the talented author Jennifer Batcher. We had Noel Whittaker on a little while ago, and he actually said he's written lots and lots of books on finance and whatever, but he said he actually sits down and writes the chapter headings before he starts. Do you do anything similar to that? Or?
My chapter headings say chapter 1, 2, 3, 4, 5.
That sounds quite a bit as though...
I think it's different, isn't it, if you're doing non-fiction, which I have. I mean, I have written a non-fiction book on writing.
Yes.
So that's when I would have done things like dialogue, character, you know, will this idea work, how to test it, etc.
Yes. Right. And a lot of your books are on audio?
Yes, all of them are.
Yes, which is terrific. But how do you feel about somebody reading your book? Now, Selva actually said to me, which I think is true, is that many authors don't actually listen to their book when it's being read by somebody else. And I actually, The Homestead on the River was my last novel that was published by HarperCollins, and I had a wonderful English actress who read it. And she did the Irish part and a lot of it really well, but she really, really, which I didn't listen to, sadly, overplay the Australian accents at the end. And I'm just wondering, have you ever sort of had that experience, or have you been happy with everybody that's read your books, or on audio, I should say?
I always thought at one stage that I could do it myself because I would understand the characters and the intonation and everything. But it's quite a skill
Yes.
reading, you know, for a book like that, a long time, you know, sitting down for hours and doing it. But yes, I've had a few little hiccups along the line where I have preferred someone else rather than the original
Yes.
reader.
It was certainly a lesson to me to make sure that you listen to all the accents right through, because in particular cases, you know, like in the one I'm talking about, the Australian accents didn't come until the end, so I didn't bother to listen. So from Shadows of Power, otherwise known as Indecent Ambition, you then went on to write A Very Public Scandal and others. Are there any particular novel that you've written that jumps out as being your favourite? I mean,
Well-
apart from the one that started you off.
Writers are often asked that, and I guess it's like children, really.
Yes.
While you're writing that book, it is your favourite. Otherwise, that's why I've rejected all the others that didn't work. You know,
Yes.
I can have many attempts before a book comes to life. I could have written up to, usually I can tell by about 10 to 15 pages.
Yes.
So I like and love all my books. But I guess as we're talking today about the Polish background, the two
Yes.
books that I have used there, I was very, you know, my heartstrings were tied to that. And the one you just mentioned, Indecent Ambition, was about a Polish refugee who marries into a squattocracy family.
Right.
It's a marriage of convenience, and the mother-in-law is not very happy about this refo. If you remember, that's what people were called in the 1950s, who came from Europe.
Or a wog.
Some people. Yes,
We
exactly.
all- yep.
So that was that book. And then my latest one, A Dark Side of the Harbour, also draws very strongly on what Australia was like in the 60s.
Yes.
And then I'd never used Brisbane in any of my books before. So this time the story needed it, you know.
Yes.
And I used the Polish church at Bowen Hills. I talked about New Farm and about the Italian migrants that were there.
Yes.
And I told a little bit of that Polish history that is really unknown. I mean, we all have heard of the ghetto uprising in Warsaw, but there was an uprising by the citizenry too, aided by the Home Army in August 1944. And this was at a time when the Russians were already across the other side of the river, the Vistula River, and they allowed the German massacre to go on to get rid of all those who would have been resistant to the Soviets.
Right.
So that was that is sort of unknown. And then there's another thing that happened that Gorbachev himself finally admitted the truth about. In the forests of Katyn, which I think are in Belarus, or they were then, very early once the Soviets moved in, and this is what my father managed to escape, they shot 20,000 intellectuals, you know, academics, officers, priests, anyone that was of the intelligentsia.
Right.
And when these graves were discovered, even during the war, the Germans, of course, blamed the Russians and the Russians blamed the Germans. And the Poles themselves were never allowed to mourn their dead in Poland. And it was because it was Stalin who signed the order for that to happen. So Gorbachev had the courage to actually be honest about what had happened there.
Right.
So that's just a small part of my story, but people have told me when they've read the book how interesting it was to learn things that might never have come to their attention in any way. You know, so my books are entertainments that also have a storyline that tells you something about the world, and also I always write about strong female
I was
heroines.
going to say that. I was going to say that, particularly in Dark Side of the Harbour. Yes, you've got very strong female characters there, and that is one of your traits of your novels, I should say, isn't it?
Well, with a mother like mine.
I was going to say. You said she was
taught
a
me all I
fiery
knew.
redhead. Yes.
Exactly.
Yes.
And I mean, you talked about Noel Whittaker just before.
Yes.
I remember just saying to one of the girls who works with my super fund, she was talking about, would you like to come to these talks, Jennifer, that we're giving to just women?
Yes.
And I said, Millie, I'm way ahead of you. 15 years ago, I wrote a book about a woman who established her own Wealth for Women business.
Right.
That it was just for women to come and find out about the stock market and investing, etc.
Right.
So I've always been on top of things like that women have to take charge of their own lives, that you can't wait for the white knight.
Exactly, and sadly, as you're aware, then you might also be left on your own.
Right. That's right, exactly, Rosemary.
Tragically, your husband has died, hasn't he?
Yes.
And, which does leave you on your own, but you have, is it one dog, a beautiful dog, or two?
I've always had German Shepherds.
Right.
So,
they're there to protect you. Yes.
Thank you. And you talked about if I'd written screenplays or whatever before. I started writing something that was a totally different storyline from what I normally wrote. And I said to my agent, I'm going to write it as a screenplay. She said, no, you're not. You're going to do it as a novella.
Right.
And so I did. And it features a German Shepherd.
Oh,
And when I married, I read the last chapter of that book at my wedding celebration. And it's about a woman who had the courage to be brave and accept love, no matter what might happen in the future.
Oh, how wonderful. Well, we are sadly running out of time because I could go on chatting to you for a long, long time, but just very quickly, are you in the process of writing a new book at the moment?
That's my horror question.
Yes.
And I always say I'm in the process of thinking my new book into life with all the twists and turns that thrillers need.
Right.
But thank you for asking.
And I must point out again, listeners, which I think is wonderful that most of all I think are on audio, which is fantastic for our listeners. So as I've said, I could go on chatting to you for ages, but Jennifer Batcher, award-winning, multi-million-dollar selling author, thank you for spending time with us today, and I'm sure our listeners will be looking to find one of your books that they can either read or listen to, and we hope you can come back and chat to us again sometime.
Oh, thank you so much, Rosemary. I've really enjoyed it. Thank you.
Thank you.
Great friends and great chats. That was another Lots to Chat About with Rosemary Peters-Walt. Stay tuned next week for another amazing chat.